beginning a new sermon series called Stories, where we're going to walk through the stories of the Old Testament. You may recall a lot of these stories if you grew up in church like I did. You probably had a little old white-haired lady named Sister Irma who used to tell you the stories of the Old Testament, and they would have the flannel graph, and they would put the pictures of the characters up there. And do you remember that? Well, I'm going to tell you those stories again, but I'm not going to use a flannel graph, all right? Yeah, I know, it's really disappointing. But I'm hoping now that we can reinvestigate these stories as adults, to not just go through the childlike faith of those stories, but start really asking the God who was faithful in the Old Testament, what does that God look like, and what does that have to do with me? How can their stories become my stories? Where can I see and find what God is doing in that world that God is also doing in this world? And so we're beginning with what is really my favorite story in the entire Bible, and that is the story of Joseph. I love the story of Joseph. And the story of Joseph begins really with Abraham, who was his great-great-grandfather. Abraham was encountered by God and told that he would be the forefather of Israel, that he would have descendants as many as stars in the sky if he would follow him. And so Abraham did, and Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, each of which became the forefathers of Israel. There were 12 tribes of Israel, each of them named after one of the sons of Jacob. And so their descendants became really the fabric of which Israel understood themselves. And so in order to have these 12 sons, Jacob decided he was going to get married. And he fell in love with a girl named Rachel. He was moved by her. He was desperate for her, so much so that he went to Rachel's father and said, "I am so in love with your daughter. What must I do to marry her?" And Laban, this man, says, "Well, you work for 7 years and you can have my daughter." And Jacob was so in love that he agreed to these terms. That's a little crazy, right? So he worked 7 years thinking all the way through this back-breaking labor of how beautiful Rachel is going to be on their wedding day. And after 7 hard, long years of work, the wedding day happened, and the bride emerged, and she walked down the aisle, and Jacob received her and pulled the veil over and wanted to love his Rachel, but it was Leah. And Jacob asked the preacher to stop, went and found Laban and said, "We agreed that I would marry Rachel." And Laban said, "We agreed that you would marry my daughter. And Leah's the older. I got to get rid of her first." So, mid-wedding, they had to broker a second deal. "All right, fine, I'll marry Leah. But then I get to marry Rachel as well." Yeah, that's going to end well. And so he ends up marrying both of them, puts in another 7 years of work, and Jacob needs to start having his offspring, and he needs some boys. And so we're told in the text that God had pity on Leah, and so he opened up Leah's womb, and she just started having boy after boy after boy. And Rachel, whom Jacob loved with all of his heart, was having no children. And so Leah and Rachel, both because there wasn't enough drama in the family, handed over to Jacob both of their handmaid servants. And he had boys with them as well. 10 in total between Leah, 2 handmaid servants, and absolutely none from his beloved Rachel. None. And so the story of Jacob is basically one that culminates in an episode of the Maury Povich Show. Wild, wild stories in the Old Testament. But finally, Rachel conceives and has a son, his 11th son, and Jacob is crazy about this boy, as if it's his oldest son. It's clearly his favorite son. Joseph is born. It is finally the love child that he always yearned for, the son from the woman that he adored and loved. So the other 10 are like moldy old stale bread that you can just get rid of. They're boys, it's good, whatever. But Joseph, this was the baby boy he longed for. Then he had a 12th with Rachel as well, Benjamin. But Joseph, as they grew up, was his favorite. So much so that by the time they were of age and men, all of the 10 older boys knew that Joseph was his favorite. And if it wasn't enough that they sensed it, Joseph started buying him gifts as well. Now, how many in here have younger siblings? Okay, all right. Now, for those of you that have younger siblings, let's see your hand again. How many of you ever want to punch that younger sibling square in the face? Yeah, about all of you. You were that, yeah. Explains a lot, Eric. Just sometimes you just want to punch those younger siblings square in the face. They're obnoxious, they're full of themselves, they're babied. Oh, it's so annoying. Now, take that feeling that you have, for those who are older, and place an amazing Technicolor dream coat around that child. Yeah. This is what happened with Joseph. Jacob loved him so much, he started buying him finer clothes and nicer clothes. He started taking care of him more. He started telling everyone that it was obvious to all the brothers who the favorite was. And if that's not bad enough, now that's bad. If that's not bad enough, Joseph started having dreams. And those dreams were something he felt he needed to share to his older brothers. Listen, guys, I had a dream last night. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Well, your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. You got that feeling about your younger siblings again? Oh, man. The brothers, they were going to have none of this. What, you think you're going to rule over us? Is that what you think, Joseph? Why don't you go tell Daddy what you think? Well, even Daddy wasn't impressed. Oh, Joseph. Oh, keep your mouth shut. But then he had another dream, and he told his brothers about that as well. This time, he said, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down before me. This dream was the last straw. They had had enough. They grabbed him, they picked him up, they beat him, and they threw him into a pit. And they began to scheme how they would kill him. Pretty violent back in the day. And so they gathered around and decided how to kill him, and one of the brothers said, we probably shouldn't kill him. How about we sell him into slavery instead? This was apparently the wisest thing that happened in that huddle. We'll sell him into slavery instead. And so shortly after that, they see a group of Ishmaelites coming through. Now that's an interesting side story because Abraham, their great-great-grandfather, had a son as well, another Maury Povich baby that his wife Sarah wasn't conceiving, and so he went with her maidservant, had one, and then Sarah hated that child and the mom, and so they threw them out. Well, his descendants, Ishmael's descendants, are now the people who buy Joseph as a slave. And they start caravanning him around, and he gets sold a couple more times before finally he makes it to Egypt. Now, we could stop the sermon at this point. We could just read to this point, and there's a whole sermon there. You might even think this sermon could be about, don't have an ego. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. There might be consequences for that. We could preach a whole sermon about that. But we're not going to. We carry on. Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he's at a house of Potiphar. Potiphar, we're told, is one of the Pharaoh's major officials. He is very, very, very high up in Egypt, an incredibly important man. And Potiphar meets Joseph and finds that there's something special about him. So he begins to use his administrative skills, his personality, to start elevating him in his house. And eventually, he's running Potiphar's house, this key Egyptian official. That's pretty high turn to go from being sold in slavery from your brothers to now running the house of an Egyptian official. Joseph is bright, and he's intelligent, and he's skilled. And apparently, he's also very good looking. because Potiphar's wife is very into him, and she decides to play the role of cougar. She goes up to Joseph and asks Joseph to sleep with her. Joseph is a man of principle and character. He knows that he has a good gig in Potiphar's house. He knows that she's a married woman, and so he declines. Joseph comes back the next day to go about his business, and the cougar reappears. Asks once more. Once more, Joseph declines. Again, Joseph returns, and Potiphar's wife has had enough of this. So she goes up to him and grabs him and holds him. This is getting very uncomfortable. And so Joseph turns and he runs out of the house, but the cougar grabs a hold of his cloak. And as he runs, she holds on tight and he keeps running. It's as awkward as you can imagine. Off he runs into the night naked. Potiphar's wife is furious that she has been declined. Joseph is running around Egypt naked. Potiphar's wife has a scheme now. She goes to Potiphar with the clothes and says, "Your servant Jacob tried to come into my room and disrobe." She lies. She's so upset that she's been turned down. She turns the tables on him, and Potiphar is furious, as you can imagine. Slave boys aren't supposed to be trying to get with their high and powerful wives. So Potiphar throws him in jail. And Joseph goes, now formerly a slave, now finds himself in jail. We could stop the sermon here. We could get to this point of the sermon and say, we could write a really good sermon about getting in trouble for doing the right thing, making good choices and not getting good consequences. We could write a whole sermon about there being unjustness in the world. It could be a good sermon, but we won't even stop there. When Joseph is in jail, he meets two other key officials in Pharaoh's kingdom. These two jobs are the cupbearer and the baker. These two men have been thrown in jail in the same place that Joseph is. Now, a cupbearer and a baker are pretty interesting jobs in a kingdom. Both of them are important jobs because they're there to make sure that the Pharaoh doesn't die. Now, just use your imagination for what a cupbearer is for 1 second and how awkward and difficult and strange this job is. The Pharaoh sits down for a meal. There's a king's ransom put before him, the cup of the finest wine in the kingdom, and the cupbearer is supposed to walk up, pick the cup up, drink it, and wait about 3 to 5 seconds to see if he dies. If he doesn't die, the king takes the rest of the wine and finishes it because it's safe. When you're the king, people are coming after you. The baker has a similar role. Everything they cook, they could easily be compromised and put poison or unhealthy things in the king's food so that the king could die that way. People try to assassinate kings. And so these two people are important even if they're lowly positions. They make sure the king doesn't die. That's their job. And so both of them have done something, not that we're told what, but they've both done something that has caused them to go to jail. The Pharaoh is angry at them, and they are now in jail. And get this, they start having dreams. And so, as they're starting to puzzle over their dreams, Joseph hears about what their dreams are and lets them know that he's capable of telling them what it means. The cupbearer says this, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on that vine were 3 branches, and it budded, it blossomed, and they ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hands. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." What does it mean? Joseph says, the 3 branches mean 3 days. In 3 days, you will be restored to your role of the cupbearer. Pharaoh will take you back, and he will forgive you, and you will be freed from the dungeon. The chief baker hears this and thinks Joseph is doling out good news. Great, I had a dream too. Tell me what it means. In my head were 3 baskets of bread on my head. In the top basket were all kind of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. What does it mean? And Joseph says, well, I'll tell you what it means. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days. And the baker's probably, all right, good news. It says, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole. Excuse me? Oh, it's all the birds will eat away the flesh of your body. Huh? 3 days later, sure enough, it happened exactly like this. Pharaoh woke up, he was looking for some wine, looking for some bread, and there was nothing to be found. And he remembered that he'd thrown his officials in the jail. And he burned with anger for one and had compassion for the other. Called the cupbearer back and restored him. Called the baker back and had him killed. On their way out of the jail, Joseph yelled to the cupbearer, "Remember me! Tell Pharaoh about me. Don't let me be lost in here forever." And so sure enough, the cupbearer goes back. He tells Pharaoh about Joseph. And there comes a time where the Pharaoh himself has a dream. And the cupbearer says, "Sir, when I was in jail, there was a young man in there, and he could interpret dreams well. In fact, every dream I ever heard him interpret was exactly right on. You should call on him." And so the Pharaoh, after going through all of his Egyptian magicians, was getting no answers. He calls Joseph and brings him out and says, "Let me tell you about a dream I've been having, Joseph, and see if you can tell me what it means. In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when out of the river came up 7 cows, fat and sleek. They grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up. They were scrawny and ugly. They were skinny and lean. I'd never seen such ugly cows in all of Egypt. But the lean and ugly cows ate the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, they gained no weight and remained just as ugly and scrawny as before. Also in my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thinned, and it was scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the good heads. I told this to the magicians, but they had no idea what was happening." Joseph said, "I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. From right now, there's going to be 7 good years. There's going to be fat cows. There's going to be plenty of crops. Everyone in Egypt will have plenty. It will seem as if there's excess in the land. But for the 7 years immediately following that, there's going to be a famine. There's going to be no grain, no food, no full cows. We need to spend 7 years preparing for the 7 years of famine." The Pharaoh was so confident that this interpretation was correct that he took Joseph out of jail and elevated him to be one of his associates. Joseph once again is removed from a lowly place and raised to a place of high. We could stop the sermon here once again. We could say this sermon is about how God raises you from the low places, sees you when you're at your lowest, and can elevate your status to a better, more prosperous place. We could also stop the sermon here and say that God has a way of sending a sign when things are bad. Maybe it's a dream, maybe it's a reminder, but that when things are bad, God's presence is near and reminds you of a preferable future. There's lots of sermons in Joseph, but we'll still not stop here. Joseph is now the governor in the land of Egypt. Number 2, for all intents and purposes, of Egypt. He is designing a plan to make sure that Egypt can withstand the coming lean years. And so for 7 years, Joseph builds grain elevators and silos and places to store all of the extra food. They make a plan while there's excess. They keep telling the Egyptians, don't eat more than you can need. Save up, store up, lean years are coming. And so they begin to store all over the country of Egypt. Everywhere they look, everywhere they go, they're storing and storing and storing and planning and planning and planning. And you can imagine by year 5 or 6 of kind of living at a bare minimum when there's so much excess that there might have been a little bit of rumbling. But Joseph kept them focused. Let's wait until year 7. At year 7, things are going to change. And sure enough, at the expiration of 7 years, as they leaned into the next 7 years, famine came, scorching sun, low water, no crop growth at all. And the only nation in the world prepared for it was Egypt. And so the people of Egypt got it quickly. They were eating, and the rest of the world was not. It got to the point that the rest of the world came into the walls, or into the city of, or the cities of Egypt, begging for food to bring back to their homeland. Because everyone in the known world was starving and struggling and broken and unsure of what they were going to do unless Egypt would save them. And so Egypt becomes the superpower of the world. They've got the resource that no one else has, food. And everyone comes lying before them over and over and over. Joseph has elevated Egypt's status from great nation to superpower nation. They are wealthy, and it's Joseph's foresight and planning that has led him to this point. But Joseph's fortunes are about to change once more. This time his emotions are going to be attacked. Because as he's working one day, bartering what he has to the rest of the world, he sees his 10 older brothers make their way into Egypt. His father Jacob, who never quite recovered from the loss of his favorite son, realizes that in his old age and that his sons and descendants are also at risk of dying because there's nothing left to eat. So Jacob sends them off to Egypt, and they go and beg. And Joseph, now on in years, and them thinking that Joseph is probably dead, don't recognize him. And so Joseph notices that Benjamin is not there. Benjamin was his only full brother, the only other child of Rachel, Jacob's beloved. And Joseph knows how he was treated, and he's nervous that they did the same thing to Benjamin. So he goes up to them and says, "Are you the only boys in the family?" And they said, "Well, there's another one. Our father kept him back." He says, "You don't get anything until you show that other brother to me." Well, no, our father's not going to let him come here. He doesn't want to risk all of his boys walking across the desert, because then all of his descendants are gone. Joseph says, "You bring that boy back here, or there's no food." So they go back to Jacob and explain the situation, and Benjamin comes and returns, and all 11 brothers are there, and Joseph hosts a big banquet dinner for them, and he sits them down, and he feeds them all, but Benjamin in particular, he puts 5 helpings in front of, because he loves his brother. And now he's wanting to care for his brothers, but his brothers still don't realize that this man who is doing it is the brother that they sold into slavery and faked his death. Joseph has a couple more interactions with them before he tells them to bring their father. And so they go back one more time to their homeland, and they get their elderly father and all of their wives and all of their kids and all of their possessions, and they take everything that Israel owns. Israel, of course, will be the people in the nation, but Israel is Jacob's other name. And so they get their name from Jacob, Israel. The whole bit that the family has, the whole forerunning of the nation of Israel, packs up all that they have and all that they own and all the people in their family, and they move to Egypt. And upon getting back to Egypt, Joseph reveals himself to them. And there's tears, and there's crying, and there's reconciliation, and there's love. And again, we could end the sermon here. We could talk about how powerful forgiveness is. We could talk about the possibility of letting past grievances go, no matter how bad they are. That would be a really good sermon. But I don't want to end there, because the story isn't quite over yet. They spend years together in Egypt. And eventually, Jacob dies, and they send him back to his homeland to be buried. And not too long after that, the 12 sons of Jacob die, including Joseph. So I want to talk a little bit about legacy, if I could. Because just as soon as Joseph dies, the politics of Egypt begin to change. Another king comes into charge and begins to look upon these people that Joseph had been harboring in their country, and they become afraid of it. So I want to read the very end, the last we hear of Joseph in his death, Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. Would you join me in standing as we read the punctuation on the story of Joseph? Now Joseph and all of his brothers and all that generation died, But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them and forced them with labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor and brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. In all of their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. While we read the story and we say thanks be to God, there's a hint of bad news here. Joseph, who has done everything right in his life, in the face of temptation, in the face of the ability for revenge, he makes the righteous choice over and over and over. And God continues to respond by no matter what the world does to Joseph, God lifts Joseph up. Because Joseph is a righteous man who does right. He becomes the salvation of his family by moving them out of a land of poverty into a place of excess, that they may eat and multiply and spread and have generations. God's plan for Israel becoming a nation, descendants of Abraham, is really seen through in the time that Joseph takes care of his brothers and gives them an opportunity to multiply and become a nation. And this happens in Egypt, of all places. But eventually Joseph dies. And upon dying, he is forgotten. Not forgotten by the Israelites, but no longer appreciated by all what he had done for the nation of Egypt. He's forgotten, he's unimportant, he's overlooked. And as he becomes overlooked and his story begins to dim in the eyes of Egypt, problems begin to rise once more for his descendants. And so the legacy of Joseph is profoundly complicated. In the moment, he was the salvation for his people, but just as soon as he dies, it is all of his work that leads them to become slaves of the nation of Egypt. That's a complex legacy. Once again, Joseph doesn't seem to have done anything wrong, but out of his doing right leads to the enslavement of his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, his great-great-grandchildren, and so on. They become a people removed from God, grumbling to the sky. They're broken. And it's not any fault of Joseph whatsoever. At a certain point, we all lose control of the narrative that we're carefully trying to construct. Joseph's legacy, in many ways, is one of righteousness and good choices. But we have a way in our own story of looking at the story of Joseph and finding ourselves bogged down in the very moment that we're in. We find ourselves imprisoned or enslaved, or carry on the metaphor to your own story. Ill, angry, unable to forgive, financial ruin, hurt, despair. We find ourselves in those moments and we can't see at all past the place that we're stuck right now. But in order to fully interpret Joseph's story, we have to take the long view in two different directions. Joseph's story is up and down, and every time he goes down, God lifts him back up. And Joseph recognizes this. And so he doesn't yell and scream. He doesn't fall into despair when he's down. He continues to be faithful. He continues to do what God asks of him. And God keeps raising him up. But even after Joseph is dead and gone, once again, the consequences of his action lead his descendants into a very low place. Slavery. They become angry and grumbling. The more they grumble, the more work Egypt puts on them. And they've done nothing but be Israelite in the nation of Egypt. And their story just keeps descending into more and more chaos. But even after Joseph is dead and his legacy becomes complex, God breaks into that as well. We can't find ourselves taking the short view as followers of God. God sees the big picture. God sees the long view. And God takes our brokenness and our despair and our hurt, even slavery, and he restores something beautiful out of it. For just not too long after Joseph, eventually God calls Moses and raises Moses up. And Moses goes to the Pharaoh, the successor of Joseph's Pharaoh. Goes to him and says, "Let my people go." And the Pharaoh says, "Oh yeah, well, I'm not in the business of freeing slaves. It's free labor, buddy. Nice try." And Moses keeps fighting and keeps battling to the point that finally Pharaoh lets them go. And the entire nation that Joseph saved and cultivated is now saved from slavery. They walk right out of the nation, and the Red Sea parts, and they walk right through the Red Sea, and God protects them from the army coming after them. And then God leads them to the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place that Jacob, Joseph's father, was buried. The land that had been marked out for them for the beginning, given as a free gift to them by God. We can't find ourselves getting caught in the hard moments of life, the low moments, the difficult moments, and claiming that's who God is. Blaming God for where we're at, sharing our hurt, and seeing that that's the end of the story. God has a much longer view than us, and God is working on the behalf of his people for good purposes. So whatever your story is today, whatever legacy you think you're cultivating, and whatever legacy feels like it's breaking, maybe your kids don't have the faith that you yearn that they have. Maybe your financial situation is way worse than you expected. Maybe you've gotten a diagnosis from the doctor that doesn't belong to you but belongs to someone else. Maybe you feel like you keep receiving the fruit of someone else's labor when you've been nothing but faithful in righteousness and righteous. Why, you might ask, does God treat me like this? Well, I invite you to look at the story of Joseph. No matter what the world throws at him, God keeps elevating him out of the low. And so whatever it is you're struggling with, your call is to not fix it. Your call is not to be better than maybe God would help you. Your call is to be faithful where you're at. Whatever you're caught in, whatever has got you, if it's grabbing you by the ankles and pulling you back, be faithful in the midst of the struggle. Because God has got a long view of salvation. God has got a long view of exodus from slavery. God has got a plan to make something beautiful out of the place that you're at. You must only be patient. And in your patience, be faithful. And you will find that God will elevate you from the place that you're at. The band is going to come out and sing a song. We sang other people's songs earlier. They're going to lead us in a song that's their own now. And we've sung it a couple times here. It's called God Help Me to Be. And as you sing this last song, I invite you to make this your prayer. That wherever you're at in life right now, whatever your struggle is, whatever feels like it's winning, pray to God that God would help you to be a faithful person in the midst of the struggle. Because for those of us who are faithful, God will elevate. God will change this world upside down on behalf of those who follow him. And so we will find ourselves restored no matter where we struggle now if we will just follow God for the long haul. Would you stand and sing this prayer with me?